On our Facebook page, the gender demographic is about 87% male, 13% female.
I have never been a proponent for nuclear energy. It's because of the consumption, right? Because it allows us to continuously consume that I believe is unsustainable.
Do you think other forms of energy will prevent us from consuming as much?
If we're running out of it, yes. I think we will start to ration it and reuse things as opposed to just creating a new one.
Well, what about solar and wind then? Sun will always shine, the wind will always blow.
Those give us life support.
Thin gruel of a diet of energy.
Yeah. I believe we don't really appreciate what we have, and I only speak for myself.
So you intuitively perceive wind and solar as being energy sources that are not on the same par with like oil and gas.
In the scope that we are currently using them, and I think that if we amplify the scope of both wind and solar, then we're also going to be looking at larger destruction as well.
So you recognize that wind and solar are environmentally invasive forms of energy generation. They take up a lot of area.
Yeah.
In order to prevent unacceptable levels of environmental destruction, limit how much wind and solar we put in.
We'll have to use them in different ways, incorporating them within already existing structures.
I actually looked at this with my own home about if I covered the house with solar panels, how much would I make? And the problem was it wasn't nearly enough. Their performance went down. Every single time I go on the roof to clean the solar panels, I'll be putting my life at risk.
We have roofers, we have people that do that professionally.
My brother's a roofer. It's a rough job. That's why a 21-year-old like him was out roofing roofs and making big money because he was putting his life at risk, just like the coal miners.
You perceive it as a good thing to constrain energy supply, right?
Yeah, I do.
Going to a low energy lifestyle will almost certainly correlate to going to a lower quality of life lifestyle. While efficiency is worthy of being pursued and we could probably all knock 25% of our energy consumption out, that's not nearly enough to eliminate the need for fossil fuels. We should pursue more energy efficient lifestyles, absolutely. How far can we go though? Will it be enough to make it so that we don't need to have better and newer forms of energy generation? I don't think so. I don't think even close.
And you don't see wind and solar as...
We have been trying to put solar and wind online for decades. It is still on the order of about 1% of total energy production in the United States. Wind is quoted in terms of its capacity. Like you'll say, this is a 3 megawatt windmill. If I have a 3,000 megawatt nuclear plant, 1,000 of these windmills are equivalent to one of these. The wind is only blowing about 15% of the time, 1 out of 6. That correlation becomes absolutely meaningless now because one is running all the time and the other one is only running 1 out of 6 times. If you had a car and you thought, I'm going to go out and get in my car and turn the ignition and I have a 1 in 6 chance the car is going to turn on, how useful would that car be to you? The wind industry says, that's okay, Chelsea. You need to have 6 cars. Energy is all about reliability.
Can we address those concerns by using batteries, which are making great advances with doing nothing more than a laptop?
It's a very, very expensive proposition to use battery backup for the grid. It has not ever been able to be accomplished on a grid level before because of how much it costs to store a watt hour in a battery. You're not even looking at lithium ion, you're looking at cheap batteries. You know, you're looking at like lead acid, I mean really cheap batteries, because you're gonna need a lot of them. It's better to get a bunch of lousy ones than to get a few really good ones.
If we had a high conducting, or what do you call them?
Superconducting?
Intermittent power from multiple sources.
If you want to make a power transmission line, if you want to make the economic case pay off for it, you have to show how electricity is going to be thrown through that line almost all the time. Otherwise, it's not worth building. It costs too much money. So the idea that, okay, there's going to be a wind farm here, and there's going to be a solar array here, and there's going to be a wind farm over here, and one of these 3 at any time will be working, but we'll have power transmission lines to all of them. I mean, that's just nonsensical. People who propose that haven't run the numbers. People don't want to see power plants, power transmission lines. They will fight tooth and nail against power transmission lines. We need to have a reliable energy source that is close to where the energy is needing to be consumed.
I know how you can get more women on board.
Okay.
Go on Oprah.
Oh, how could I get in her book club?
If you were to make the oil sands just a little tiny bit cleaner, then they would perk up their ears as opposed to clean energy in and of itself, because it relates to something they know.
I sat on the plane next to a guy who was in the oil business, and he was telling me all about the oil sands and how much money they're making and so forth. I was just sort of sitting there taking it in, listening. Gas, oh my God, how much does gas cost here? $1.10?
Yeah.
Gas costs $1.10?
Yeah, it's expensive because we have more tax on gasoline, which I think is a good idea.
What do you pay for gas?
I'm paying like $3.50 for gas.
Really? I thought gas was cheaper in America. The Canadian dollar's almost on par, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, y'all are doing it in liters.
And I think just about every media outlet I've seen is drumming up fear. From the New York Times to the Huffington Post to Fox News.
There's been a recent spike in infant deaths in Philadelphia, and there's one expert right now who's saying it is radioactive levels in our water that's to blame for that.
This has been a very bipartisan approach to scaring the public.
I was just reading this morning an article saying there detected radioactivity in milk, and I thought, of course they detected radioactivity in milk. All milk is radioactive. They really meant to say was there was a particular radioisotope they found in the milk that came from the Japanese nuclear plant. The article, of course, didn't mention that, which would make people think, uh-oh, my milk has gone from zero radioactivity to some radioactivity, which must be bad, and I must be in real trouble now.
In terms of the public's perception of risk, things that might be true because I read them on the internet. Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeted today, the causes of death worldwide in March 2011, starvation, 3 million.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, big fan of his. We've needed somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson ever since Carl Sagan died. But yeah, what's the first one on his list? Starvation.
Okay, so starvation, 3 million, malaria, 250,000, car crashes, 100,000, quakes and tsunamis, 28,000. Body count on nuclear power deaths is what? Low?
Civilian nuclear power in the United States hasn't killed anyone. Body count would be 0.
So when 3 Mile Island releases some radiation, you'd want to incorporate statistical likelihood of someone getting thyroid cancer and
no, because
in the number?
Even the statistical likelihood is a theory that is not based on facts. It's called the linear no threshold hypothesis. And it's not based on epidemiological data. It's based on the assumption that radiation will harm you at whatever degree to whatever degree you're exposed.
I thought that was established actually.
No,
I thought there was some,
it's established.
I've heard that there's
it's
no
established
such thing as
in
safe
policy.
radiation.
That's where that no such thing as safe radiation, that comes from the linear no threshold hypothesis. It is established in regulation, yet there is no epidemiological data to back that up. There is no study that says we have taken a cohort of people and we've exposed them to 1% more radiation than normally would get, and we've seen 1% more cancer. In fact, there are many places in the world where background levels of radiation are substantially higher. If the linear no threshold hypothesis was in fact true, or even approaching truth, you would see statistically significantly higher levels of cancer in those populations, those cohorts. But what happens? Not only is there not higher levels of cancer, there are actually suppressed levels of cancer, which leads to a theory that does have substantiation in the data, and that's called hormesis. Hormesis is simply a little bit is good for you. And radiation appears to be one of these things where a little bit more is actually good for you and suppresses your development of cancer. You might say, well, why would a little bit of radiation be good for me? When you go and exercise, you damage your muscles, but your body rebuilds them and rebuilds them stronger than they were before. Radiation stimulates cellular damage, but it also stimulates the body's repair mechanisms. If hormesis became policy instead of linear no threshold, we would have an incredibly different approach to radiation. Okay. In fact, in some ways, we actually do accept hormesis when it comes to natural radiation, but we don't accept it when it comes to artificial radiation. The reality is that there's no difference between the two. Even if linear no threshold was actually true, let's say for a minute it was true, this was the reality of the world, you would still be much better off establishing an entire world powered by nuclear power. And the reason why is because of the radioactive releases from coal. You would want to shut down coal so you could have nuclear, because coal releases more radiation than nuclear by several orders of magnitude. The notion there's no safe amount of radiation, that is not a substantiated or even an accurate statement. It is probably actually utterly inaccurate, but it is commonly found as the basis of public policy around the world.
That was my understanding until just now. There was no safe level of radiation. 2
great books on this, Terrestrial Energy by Bill Tucker and The Power to Save the World by Gwyneth Cravens, go into this topic extensively. Until this notion of low exposure levels of radiation is addressed and put to bed, it will forever dog the nuclear industry. A nuclear article will be written. Author of the article will go to me or Rod Adams or John Wheeler or somebody who's kind of known as a public advocate for nuclear. And then to go find the other side, Ed Lyman or Jim Riccio of Greenpeace or one of those other guys. Now contrast this with an article around solar or wind, and because I look for this all the time. I'm always trying to see, is there another side in those articles? There's never another side. Such and such a company has announced they're going to put 50 megawatts of windmills in this site. You know, world rejoices. And they've chewed up half the mountain to put the windmills up there. They get more subsidies per megawatt hour than any other form of energy by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. I mean, it is huge. We're offering to buy back solar energy from people who would produce it at 35 to 50 cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, that's obscene. Why on earth, if you're making energy at your home, you should sell it back to the grid at whatever the grid is buying at that time. The grid should not have to buy energy from you at some massively increased price.
But they're subsidizing technology until it gets more efficient.
When all of those tariffs are reduced, the things that we're supposed to encourage and jumpstart an industry, the industry collapses. Solar industry in Germany and in Spain is an utter collapse because of the projected removal of feed-in tariffs, because these are simply not economical sources of energy. The subsidy may be well-intentioned to try to get the industry to get going on its own, but that's usually not the way things work.
Every energy source is subsidized, right? If oil is subsidized because we're sending people off to war.
You know, the level of the subsidies are substantially lower for established industries than they are for things like solar and wind. George Monbiot, who writes in The Guardian, he has recently come out very strongly in support of nuclear power because of what happened to Fukushima Daiichi, how it survived the earthquake, and the overall effect has been nothing compared to the death and the loss of life from the tsunami. Well, he mentioned in an article he wrote yesterday that he talked to Caroline Lucas, the head of the Green Party in the UK, and he asked her why she would support subsidies on solar and wind. She goes, I oppose subsidies for nuclear, but I support them for solar and wind because nuclear is an established industry and solar and wind are still developing industries, and they need public support in order to flourish. And so George, being a very smart guy, said, well,
will you support research into thorium reactors, which could provide a much safer and cheaper means of producing nuclear power?
No, because thorium reactors are not a proven technology.
On the individual level, we are seeing a lot of people change their minds. But at the organizational level, we're not seeing any change. You know, the people who run the environmentalist organizations. And that's unfortunate.
Have you had a one-on-one where you are talking to someone and they get this?
It's tough for people who are further up the food chain in these organizations to come out and make public policy statements. A lot of people get it one-on-one, but they're afraid to be the first one to stand up and say, rah, 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 let's go do this. It's a lot easier when you feel like everybody else is behind you. Why are appeals to technological advancements always made with regards to solar and wind? It's going to get better. It's going to get cheaper. It's going to get more efficient. Don't worry about what we have now, because it's going to be better next year. But yet nuclear is assigned this position back in the 50s where it can never get better, it can never incorporate a new technology, it can never improve, and we won't even entertain if it does get any better.
Can you just do a recap what the study said?
The title of the study was Thorium was no panacea for nuclear energy. They were trying to point out deficiencies of thorium. I didn't think they were applying a very fair logic to it, because they would say thorium in a solid fueled reactor would do blah, 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 blah. And see, that's not very good. So thorium's dumb. Well, no, thorium's dumb in a solid fueled reactor. Not thorium's dumb. If you're going to go out there and try to put something out to the public saying, I'm going to authoritatively refute the use of thorium as an energy source, well, then it behooves you to do your homework. A lot of environmentalists are always trying to drive us towards using less energy because all that energy is coming from the consumption of fossil fuel. Well, let's say your energy is not coming from the consumption of fossil fuel. Then you could use more energy, and you could use more energy to accomplish things that you are not able to do right now. Break up carbon dioxide, dissociate water, make fertilizer, grow crops, all that.
If we didn't have to worry about energy, we could think of so many more things to do.
If there was a lot of it, and it was cheap, and it was not harmful to the environment, what would you do that you're not doing now?
To switch over from the fuels like oil and gas and uranium, do you find that a possible problem?
I'm a lot more worried about someday looking at our descendants and to have them say, why did you give us this world that we have now? Why did you give us this world of energy poverty, of pollution, of war, of disease, when you knew there was a better way and you could have made it happen? You know, why didn't you do it? I mean, that's the same question we'd ask these guys if we could go back to 1969, right? We say, why didn't you do this? You knew about it and you could have made it happen, but you didn't. What's your excuse? Human beings have been superstitious and fearful for most of their history. An era of enlightenment has been a relatively short space of human history, and by no means assured that it will continue in that manner. I really believe that if we don't have access to affordable and clean energy, we will revert. We will go back to the way humans have been for thousands and thousands of years, which is where the powerful and the rich oppress the masses who live terrible lives trying to provide things for just a few people. We will literally not only revert to barbarism, but revert to social institutions like slavery. And I mean that with all seriousness. We live much better lives today because we have learned how to use carbon. Okay, what about thorium? Thorium has 1,000,000 times the energy density of a carbon-hydrogen bond. What could that mean for human civilization going out thousands, tens of thousands of years into the future? because we're not going to run out of this stuff. Once we've learned how to use it at this kind of efficiency, we will never run out.